you.
Thank you for your comment.
Brian Solomon, 2915 North, 875 East. I would just say that, I mean, to me, and obviously Brent Taylor as well, it's pretty obvious that limiting the use of the amphitheater, given the grandiose scale of it, to the number of parking spots or event size, it's pretty obvious that that's financially unsustainable. I would hope there's been some kind of study that was done, or I imagine some kind of business case that was put together before we built this thing. And if that exists, I would advocate that that be released publicly so that people can see the drive behind this. And if that wasn't done, then shame on whoever approved it, because without knowing how you were going to pay for the thing before you built it, that's a horrible idea. So that's my comments.
Thank you for your comments. There's no other comments at this time. We'll proceed with our agenda. Next item on the agenda is public comments on an ordinance amending the city code for grading and drainage. Our presenter is Robert Scott, our planning director.
Mayor, members of the council and audience, this is a public hearing to consider an amendment to our zoning ordinance regarding important standards regarding grading and drainage and development constraints. This initial discussion about this amendment took place back in February in a joint work session with the Planning Commission and the City Council. Since that time, the Planning Commission has had 3 additional discussions and held a public hearing on June 27th regarding this amendment. By way of background, several years ago, the zoning ordinance was amended to provide for a hillside protection zone, and there's actually 3, HP 1, 2, and 3. As a part of that, that zoning ordinance that contains 2 sections that deal with grading and drainage and development constraint standards. These standards only apply to the area zoned for hillside protection. It's common as part of our regular subdivision reviews that we regularly require that specific reviews for geologic, hydrologic, grading studies and designs be done for all subdivisions. The application of these standards to the entire city is warranted from staff's perspective. All subdivisions will benefit from applying consistent, clear, and objective grading, drainage, and hazards as part of their review. A staff committee put effort into putting together this draft amendment and include the city engineer, Lauren Gardner, who's here tonight, public works staff, planning staff, and our city administrator made up the committee. By way of a summary, I will share with you what's contained in the ordinance. So there are 2 sections of this ordinance. Excavation and grading are in 2 new chapters, 1124 and 1125, development constraints. So in essence, we're taking subsections of the hillside protection zone and we're creating new chapters that would then apply to the entire city as it relates to subdivision review. In addition to that, we already have an existing section in Chapter 10, which is the chapter that has applications or standards that apply to all zones. We've eliminated that, but kept a provision in there that simply references this is where you go to find the standards for grading and drainage. Also, at the request of the Planning Commission, one of the things that is a difficulty in writing these ordinances is when you have properties or proposals or projects that were approved previously how do you work and deal with those? So the Planning Commission made a recommendation. There are specific standards that require grading and drainage studies be done for individual lots as well as parcels and subdivisions. So for those existing subdivisions in that, where there are no grading and drainage plans, the city engineer has the ability to either waive those or to require those specific studies. So that was a request made by the Planning Commission. Beyond that, there are a number of provisions that are in this ordinance. A purpose and intent section that has been added. There was not one before. The ordinance, as I mentioned, applies to all city zones. We have specific procedural regulations for grading types and permits. A standard for parcel, subdivision, and building permits are clarified. Discussion of grading permits, cut and fill standards, drainage standards, and retaining wall standards are defined. So as part of looking at making sure that we can protect our citizens when they're dealing with and much we all recognize much of North Ogden is on hillsides, these are extremely important. We did not have time to be able to deal with the development constraints chapter, and so what that chapter is, we have not made any changes in that particular chapter, but our commitment is that the same committee is going to be working on putting together a sensitive lands chapter that will update the information that's contained therein. So let me just share a little bit about what's included within our general plan. We actually have environmental chapter and an environmental goals within our North Ogden City General Plan. Goal 1 is protect sensitive lands within the existing and future city boundaries. So again, the idea was that the standards should be applied to the entire city, not just to the hillside protection zones. So there are some strategies. Continue to use the land use approach found in the hillside protection zones to incentivize developers to avoid sensitive lands, reduce and avoid impacts on sensitive lands, create and reinforce use of rigorous disclosure statements for all property and home sales so buyers are aware of potential dangers. That's something we regularly do. We put, if there are development constraints, there are notes placed on our subdivision plats that help individuals if they are in the process of buying these lots, that they can understand that. Goal number 2 is protect the water quality of existing wetlands, springs, streams, ponds, and aquifers, and foster, encourage, create, and reward green behavior and initiatives. So these goals and strategies are a great foundation and basis for this amendment. So what are the land use considerations that the Planning Commission considered and also that you'll be considering? First of all, should the grading and drainage standards be updated? Secondly, should these standards apply to the entire city? And 3, is the amendment consistent with the general plan? The Planning Commission found as part of their public hearing that the amendment is consistent with the general plan and recommended on a 6-0 vote adoption of the amendment. Now, I have one other comment to make that is sort of a sidebar comment, so I'll entertain questions. First of all, do you want to go through the specifics of every section of the ordinance? Are you comfortable with it? Lauren and I are here. We'll be happy to answer any questions regarding any of these sections. We feel like it's been pretty well vetted, but we're here to help you understand what
Rob,
standards are.
In our copy, the lines that are highlighted in green,
Yes.
are those changes that have been made?
Those are, as we worked with the Planning Commission,
Okay.
most of the document that you have before you comes from the HP1
Right.
zones and what have you. But as we worked through this, then there were tweaks made, I'll use that term,
Okay.
to include those provisions that I referenced earlier, along with providing what we believe is additional clarity in those standards. So.
Okay.
Any other questions, Council? let me let you know that this is a sidebar note, something that's going to be coming your way. We have had, I think it's 4 variance requests for people that have fairly steep lots to be able to get a variance to reduce their front setback from 30 feet to 20 feet. And it's pretty easy to understand the benefit of doing something like that, especially when you're on a steep lot and what have you. It becomes a safety factor as far as the amount of work that needs to be done on the site. It allows for the steepness of the lot to be included within the design, as opposed to making huge retaining walls, huge foundation walls, etc., those types of things. Our hearing officer has heard, I'm pretty sure it's 4 of these. The last time that she heard one of these, she made a recommendation, and that was the city really ought to make an amendment so that this doesn't have to go before a variance review for each one of these situations. So as part of the sensitive lands discussion, or if you give us direction otherwise, that's a recommendation that staff has for you. I'll be sharing this same comment tomorrow night with the Planning Commission, but that's something that we're not proposing tonight, but is forthcoming. With that, be happy to answer further questions, Council. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. This public hearing.
Do you have anything you want to say?
I'll answer questions.
If there are questions from the group regarding this particular item on the agenda, you're welcome to ask that question.
Yeah, is that lessening the hillside protection? Have they done anything to lessen what's already in place? It's a loophole. I haven't read it. I just want to know if they're lessening it. I don't know why other parts of the city should be held accountable for what a hillside protection is.
My response would be we're strengthening the standards, not lessening them.
Any other questions on this particular item? Then we'll close the public hearing and move on to have a motion to close the public hearing.
So moved.
It's been moved, and
I'll second.
we have a second. Any other discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, public hearing is over. We'll move on to the next item. On item 5, discussion or action to consider ordinance amending city code for grading and drainage. Our presenter will then be Robert Scott, our planning director.
So the appropriate thing to do tonight would be, if you feel comfortable with the ordinance, to make a motion to adopt the amendment.
Do we have an ordinance number?
Yes, it's 2018-17.
I'll make a motion that we approve ordinance 2018-17 in regards to grading and drainage as presented by Rob Scott.
We have a motion to approve ordinance number 2018-17, the city code for grading and drainage. Do I have a second?
Second.
We have a second. Begin the voting with Councilwoman Stoker,
Yes.
Councilman Swenson,
Yes.
Swanson, Councilman Barker,
Yes.
Councilman Severy,
Yes.
Councilman Turner.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is discussion on ranked choice voting. I'll turn over to Annette Spenlove for the introduction of our guests this evening.
Come down here for a minute. Council and Mayor, this past legislative session, the state legislators approved House Bill 35. It's a pilot program on ranked choice voting. Mr. Holdaway contacted me, him and one of his associates had contacted me asking to meet with the mayor, and the mayor suggested that we bring this to the council so you can learn more about this. And after Mr. Holdaway's done, I have a few more comments. So we'll turn the time over to him to present this.
Thank you, Mrs. Spenlove. Mayor, thank you for the time, and members of the council, I appreciate the opportunity to take a few minutes, and given the time constraints that you have and respecting your time, I'd just like to go to the PowerPoint. House Bill 35, as was mentioned, was passed this past legislative session. It is a pilot program for municipal cities or municipalities to utilize ranked choice voting as a way of running their elections in the 2019 election. There is a sunset to the bill. 2016, it's due to sunset if this isn't something that cities feel like is valuable, then this will go off the books. If we go to the next slide. This bill has an interesting kind of history. It was started, actually my first experience with ranked choice voting was in a Republican Party convention, where we used this in order to determine who would be the candidate going forward. And this was back in, early 2000s or so. It was at a state convention. Subsequent to that, Representative Chavez Houck, a Democrat, carried this piece of legislation to make it statewide, including state elections. This past legislative session, Representative Mark Roberts picked up the baton and carried it. Now, if you know anything about the state legislature, you've got Representative Chavez Houck on one side of the spectrum in terms of political philosophy, and Representative Mark Roberts on the other side of the spectrum. So it's not a conservative or liberal issue. It's just a new way of looking at elections. As you can see, they had numerous sponsors. Representative Fossen, your former representative, was one of the co-sponsors of this as well. House Bill 35 passed overwhelmingly with 64 yes votes and 2 no votes. In the Senate, it was 22-0. The Senate sponsor, Senator Stevenson, is Taxpayers Association representative and has been there for years as well. So, I mean, you can see that there was quite a lot of support legislatively for this. Next slide. The benefits that this new way of approaching voting is, there are numerous. Here are a few. One of the things that attracted me to this is I serve on a board for, it's called Voterize, and it's a 501c3 organization that's designed to stimulate the millennial vote and Generation X vote. We've seen that go down into the tank recent years. Over the course of the session, I provided some testimony in support of this as a result of that group's support of this concept. The other benefit, and basically what my feeling is this stimulates more voter engagement. It also stimulates a more civil campaign. In terms of electioneering and campaigning. If you're not the first choice, you certainly don't want to be the last choice. So if you're not the first choice, you want to be the second. So you're going to put your best foot forward as you campaign for election. And just as importantly, is we see this as a cost savings. This would, going forward, would preclude any need for a city to have a primary election. So the costs of running a primary election would be eliminated. Let's go to the next slide. This is how it works. in one single election, you could have multiple candidates running for a particular office. In this example, you've got Ichabod Crane and whatever running for United States Senate, and then what this does, you can see the ballot set up. What the electorate is asked to do is to select their first choice, and then to just work their way down the system. They're not obligated to select more than one, but they have that option. They have the choice to make that. Voters rank their choices according to preference, and the instructions for this isn't new. It's been done in other municipalities and other areas of the country. So, I mean, we've got some history with this. If we go to the next slide. The candidates are ranked, and then based on the preference, if there were more than, obviously if there are only two candidates, there wouldn't be a need for ranked choice voting. But where there are more than three candidates or more running for the same office, what the electorate would do would be ranking those 1, 2, and 3. Whoever came in third, they would be dropped off the ballot, and those votes, second place votes for those that were dropped off the ballot, would then be put into place and into play for the first or second place. So you can see by doing this, what this would present is there would never be a plurality election. And by plurality, less than 50%. I'm going to share with you just some personal experience. Years ago, I ran for the state legislature. I live in an area that's a very swing district, R's and D's. In that election, there was a Democrat running, myself, and then there were two minor candidates running, an American Independent and a Green Party candidate. I was elected to represent that area in the state legislature by less than 50% because of the percentage of votes that were pulled off, and because it was so close in that election. If ranked choice voting would have been in place, the votes that went to the third or the fourth candidate, those votes, the second choice votes, would then have gone in. I may not have been elected, but the person that would have been elected would have represented a majority. So there's value in that, in my opinion, in terms of just recognizing our elected officials are there to represent the majority voice that go to the elections. And the rest of those bullets basically kind of go along in that. One of the other points that I want to make related to this is that if on the first go through, in terms of tallying the votes, 50% is met, then there's no need to go on to additional rounds. Once the 50% threshold is met, 50% plus 1, then there's no need to go on to additional rounds in terms of the voting. Implementing ranked choice voting, this is probably the biggest challenge that we're going to have. And I suspect your city recorder may bring this up. I hope she does. The current equipment that the state has, there are only 2 counties that have the necessary equipment that allow ranked choice voting as it is. We've got confirmation that for Weber County, which I'm told is an ES&S equipment, there is some software that is available that would allow the current equipment to be able to be used should North Ogden want to go in that direction in terms of using the legacy equipment that we've got until future equipment is purchased. With that, there may be a one-time cost associated with it. The one-time cost would be well below the cost that it would be in order to run a primary election. So the cost savings would still be realized by any city that's interested in running it. We've been quoted by the ES&S folks that $15,000 per county would be what they would charge for the software upgrade for the existing legacy equipment. That's not been provided to me in a document yet, it's verbally, but we're working on trying to get that secured by hopefully the first part of September and be able to have that information. Ranked choice voting, the vote by mail, we see this as complementing the vote by mail process. Tallying votes and verifying vote by mail legitimacy, legitimacy isn't the right word, but the vote by mail accuracy in terms of the person actually sending it in. We see that as two different processes. One is verifying signatures in terms of this is the actual person that sent this in by vote by mail, and the other is simply tallying those votes. The next slide. As I said, implementing ranked choice voting eliminates primary elections at a cost savings to cities. Depending upon the size of the city, that cost saving could be quite significant. North Ogden is not the only city that we're making presentations to. In fact, wherever we've got the listening ear, we're making the pitch to city councils. Personally, I've talked to a number of different cities. Taylorsville City, I've talked to officials in the capital city, Salt Lake City. We've got some cities down in Utah County as well that are expressing some interest as to learning more about it. The other challenge that some people have brought up is the need to educate the electorate in terms of this is a new process. This is the way to achieve it. We feel like given the changes with some of the cities, and particularly statewide, the vote by mail, the opportunity to educate is there by way of some of the cards that we send out in terms of notifying the electorate that of the vote by mail coming up. With that, we could also include some instructions in terms of how that process goes forward. There are other means as well, social media, inserts into water or power bills, things like that. And then we're also partnering with other organizations as well. Voterize, the League of City, or the League of Women Voters, are a couple of the others. I've got a video, a short video, less than 2 minutes. If we could show the one on Minneapolis, this kind of gives you these are 3 areas that have utilized vote by mail, ranked choice voting. Maine statewide just finished their elections. Minneapolis has used it. Santa Fe just finished as well. The one I think that's most useful, and you're welcome to go to the website and view these others, but given respecting your time, I'd go to the Minneapolis one. It'd only take a minute to watch if we could cue that up.
In most elections, you only vote for one candidate for each office. But in some elections, voters can rank 3 or more candidates for each office. It's called ranked choice voting. Here's an example of how it works. All of the candidates will be listed on the ballot in 3 columns. Make your first choice vote in column 1 by filling in the oval of the candidate you'd most like to win. Vote for your second choice in column 2, and make your third choice in column 3. That's all there is to it. Now let's see how the votes are counted. Let's say there are 4 candidates running for mayor: Asha, Zach, Omar, and Lucy. Once the polls close, we count all the first choice votes first. To be elected mayor, a candidate needs more than half the votes. In this example, Asha has more than half of the votes, so she's declared the winner. However, if no candidate gets more than half the votes, we start eliminating candidates and counting the next choices of those who voted. In this example, Zach is the candidate with the smallest number of first choice votes, so he is cut. We use the second choice votes on Zach's ballots and count those voters' second choices instead. If one of the remaining candidates now has more than half of the total votes, that candidate is declared the winner. If not, the next lowest candidate, Lucy, is eliminated. Her votes are now counted for the next choice on the ballot. Some of Lucy's votes went to Zach, who was already eliminated, so those new votes for Zach instead count for those voters' third choice candidate. We are now down to 2 candidates, and Omar clearly has more than half of the votes. That makes him the winner. That's how ranked choice voting works. For more information on ranked choice voting, visit our website.
So as you can see in this example, Asha was feeling pretty good after the initial vote, or the first round. But it turns out that the majority of people actually would have supported somebody else using ranked choice voting. So next slide, we're almost done. In order for this to take place, there are a couple of things that need to happen. City councils with their city recorder, their voter election representative need to notify the Lieutenant Governor's office by January 1st of this upcoming year if you're interested in having it happen in 2019. I know that there are a lot of steps before that could ever happen. You need to do your due diligence in terms of whether or not this would be something that North Ogden would benefit from in terms of costs. Again, going back to voter engagement and participation, I see this as positive just in that it provides a broader voice in terms of allowing voters, rather than just clicking one or voting for one person, and then if that person happens to not be the person that is elected, and there are more than 2 candidates, your voice may not, you'd have a stronger voice by using ranked choice voting. With that, I'm open for any questions that you might have.
Corey, I'm kind of interested in what Annette would say about this being our city recorder.
So am I. So,
Corey, I have a couple of questions. Maine, they are the only state that's strictly this. Is that correct?
that's correct.
What do they do when it's a presidential election, and what happened to the electoral college?
Presidential, it was limited to a governor and then a state, or not state, yes, it was a state legislative race in the use for Maine. And it was 4 primary elections. They had, I think, 5 candidates in Maine for the Democratic nomination.
So they didn't use it for a presidential election?
No.
So every 4 years...
In fact, it was just used just last June.
So every 4 years, the people of Maine are going from one way of voting to another way of voting. Is that correct?
I don't know the answer to that, Annette. That could very well be. That's a great question, though.
Well, one of the things for me is when we started doing vote by mail, it took a while for the citizens to grasp that. And now North Ogden citizens have got that down very well. Mm-hmm. And to change that every 4 years, because the electoral college is how we elect a president,
right,
would really compromise this for me. Also, I know that Davis County has told their election officials, which are the city recorders, that they will not support them in this election. And I know also that the state has, in the last year, has purchased almost $10 million in new voter equipment and software that they have trained our election judges on already. So if we have counties that aren't going to support us because they are the ones that purchased this equipment, if they're not going to support us in that, where do we come up with the money to do this? And also, because our budgets are already prepared, and where do we come up with the money to train people and to educate people? It just, people don't learn this in 1 year. They learn it from doing it over and over.
Right.
And I know this is just a pilot program, but right now I'm not budgeted for that, and I have some really big concerns. And because I'm an election official, I am going to ask Ricky Hatch is here from Weber County. Is it all right if I ask him what the county thinks about how they would move forward?
That would be fabulous.
Are you guys okay with that?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Ricky?
Thanks, Annette, and I appreciate Mr. Holdaway and his fellow lobbyist Stan Lockhart for their participation in government. I really do appreciate that. We've got clerks across the state have received a lot of concerned phone calls from city recorders just trying to understand what this is and wondering what our thoughts are. As far as Weber County goes, Weber County Elections Office, we do not feel it would be wise to administer this, providing assistance as far as administration of this election. Let me explain why before I just sound like a sourpuss and sit down. There are two main reasons, or two main general reasons. The first one is logistical, and that's really the main reason why we're opposed to implementing something like this, even on a pilot basis. The second one is policy, and the clerks rarely delve into policy, but because they were brought up tonight, I may address some of the points that were brought up. But let's focus on the logistical reasons first, because they're the most pressing. There is an extra cost to running ranked choice voting. Mr. Holdaway correctly mentioned a verbal quote that the clerks received also from ES&S, the state elections vendor, of $15,000 per county. As of right now, North Ogden is the only city that I'm aware of in Weber County that's interested in possibly pursuing this or listening. That would be a cost that would be passed along to whatever city or cities decide to do that. Secondly is the cost of printing could possibly increase. When you're a by-mail elections jurisdiction, if you move on to a second card that requires 2 ballots, that almost doubles the cost of the election. In 2016, during the presidential election, Weber County actually ran a mock ranked choice voting mock-up of what that would look like. The entire first page was simply for the presidential election, and the second side of that first page then had to contain all of the state, county, local school board, and all of those different elections. It pushed Weber County to 1.5 pages or to 2 cards. And so you have to consider the costs there. Next, you have to consider the cost of voter education, which, as Annette said, it's not a one-time thing. The city of Santa Fe, which is about the same size as Ogden City, spent $350,000 on voter education and outreach for their implementation of ranked choice voting. The next main reason is we would have to, as Weber County, and this is critical, we would have to, as Weber County, run separate elections for for North Ogden or any city that does ranked choice voting and the rest of the cities. It requires different programming, and it requires a different, when ballots currently come in, when envelopes come in, we take them and we batch them up regardless of which city they're from and process them and verify them and then run them through the scanner. If we have one city that's ranked choice voting, we would now have to separate every ballot from that city from all of the other ballots and treat those separately, because those would go through a separate scanning stream. And we would have to actually shut down our election system for all other cities, reopen it for this ranked choice voting city, and then scan them, back that up, shut that down, and then back open the others. It really does create a real logistical issue on election night as well as prior to election day. Next, remakes. We have about 1 to 3% of our ballots that need to be remade because people have marked things, spilled coffee on it. For whatever reason, that ballot's not able to be read. With ranked choice voting, the time spent on creating, that's a very manual process to remake a ballot, because we have to have checks, always two polling officials verifying that it's done properly. With ranked choice voting, instead of an election being one mark, it could be up to 8 or 10 or 11 in the case of the presidential election. So it will dramatically increase the time for remakes. And then finally, Mr. Holdaway is correct. ES&S is the system that Weber County is electing, as well as about 26 of the 29 counties are selecting to use. This would, next November's election would only be the third or fourth election that Weber County runs on this new system, which there's a lot to understand and learn. And so we're uncomfortable, on top of using a new system, to put a new add-on to a new system. This additional module is an outside module that runs in Microsoft Excel. So your election would be tabulated by the election software, and then the results would be imported into Microsoft Excel. This Excel program has not been certified by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which state code in Utah requires that our election systems be certified by the EAC. Those are the logistical concerns that I have, that clerks statewide have about ranked choice voting. I'll talk about policy, and I'll try to be quick because I know it's a long evening and there are lots of other important things to talk about. I think ranked choice voting, when I first learned about it, I thought this is a great idea. And I do think the ranked choice voting is a good idea in theory and in specific circumstances such as conventions, where you have everybody together and you can go through the rounds together while everybody's there. I don't think it is a good idea. And the research that I have done, which is only a few hours of research, but the research that I've done has cast questions in my mind about the how beneficial it is. The first concept is plurality. There's a lot of discussion about how bad it is when a candidate is elected by fewer than 50% of the votes. Yet 3/4 of the states in the country deal with accept plurality as it is. They have no other way to deal with it. They just accept it. Only a quarter of states actually have processes in place to address plurality. The other thing with plurality is ranked choice voting, I believe, often creates what's called a false majority. In other words, as people mark their first and second choice, some of them only mark their first choice, or some of them can't figure out how to mark them. And so in continuing rounds, their votes fall off. The city of Santa Fe spent 4 hours, the city council, debating trying to define what the term majority was. And eventually they said majority is based on the number of ballots cast in the final round, which might be, so the winner might get 51% in the final round, but if you consider how many ballots were cast in the first round, that could only be 30%. In fact, in 2010 in San Francisco, a supervisor was elected with the majority of votes in the final round, and yet over 50% of voters did not mark that person's name on the ballot. An easy solution to this, if plurality really chaps your hide, there's an easy solution as a city council. Instead of having everybody run for a city council seat, just create city council seats that are all still at large, but the candidates have to declare, I'm running for council seat A, B, C, D, all 6. You could have them be at large. And then they just simply select which seat they run for. That virtually guarantees that you will eliminate any plurality concerns, because now you have races that will have 2 to 3 or maybe 4 candidates, as opposed to a big clump of candidates all running for, quote, city council. And that solution costs no money and creates no confusion. Another concern deals with voter confusion, and Annette brought this up quite well. If we were to implement this, let's say North Ogden, you decided to contract with the ES&S, pay the $15,000 on top of the regular cost of the election. Every odd year, your voters would vote via ranked choice voting. Every even year, they would vote traditional voting. And after 7 years of running elections in Weber County, I know how confused voters get, sometimes simply by marking the oval correctly. It's shocking how many times those ovals are not marked properly. This would add confusion. Another thing is that neighborhoods that tend to be poorer in the socioeconomic spectrum tend to have higher ballot spoil rates. So the more complex a ballot is, the greater of a negative impact that has on minority populations or lower income type populations. That's why in Memphis, the NAACP actually fought against ranked choice voting when it came before the city council, because they felt it was discriminatory. The argument of civility that ranked choice voting promotes more civility and turns it into a more issue-oriented campaign. If I'm running for office and I want to placate all voters and look good to all voters, I won't be mean to the other candidates, but I also won't express my strong opinions and my political views. In my analysis, ranked choice voting will turn political races into watered down contests where it will be very difficult to identify county or candidate policy, because the candidates will be more careful in how they present their message, whereas now, and unfortunately sometimes that turns into uncivil remarks, whereas now they are more interested and able to voice their opinion as it really is. Two more very quick things. Several cities have opted to use ranked choice voting, only to later where the people voted it in, only to 2 or 3 years later have them voted out. The city of Pierce County in Washington, it passed it in 2006. In 2009, 71% of the voters decided to repeal ranked choice voting. Pitkin County, Colorado, in 2007 implemented it. In 2010, 65% of voters decided to repeal that. And just last year, San Francisco, which has had ranked choice voting for a long time, probably the longest in the nation, their San Francisco Chronicle, in their editorial, said we should do away with ranked choice voting because it's just too complex. With that, I apologize for taking so much time. I'm available either tonight, or if you want to call me or email me, I'm happy to talk to you in more detail about the research that I've come up with and any other questions that you might have.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I just say a couple things, Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Thank you. Just to respond to some of the points that Mr. Hatch brings up. As far as what I would ask is that I've got a 9-page document that goes through Santa Fe, Maine, and Minneapolis, as far as some of the issues that Mr. Hatch has brought up, as far as cost, more civil voter engagement. I'd love to be able to. In fact, I'll email that to Mrs. Cottle, and hopefully that'll be passed on to each of you. I do feel like change is difficult. I recognize that. However, I also see this as a positive in terms of just voter involvement. Just as a matter of information, fairvotes.org is a national group that is pushing this across the country. And that's actually who has contracted with me to do this after the session, and the support that I offered during the session. They have quite a lot of literature, academic literature, in terms of the benefits of this as well. In addition to that, they will be at the League of Cities and Towns fall convention with a breakout session going A to Z as far as costs and confusion and things like that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Holdaway, thank you for presenting this tonight. I'm all for civility. I think candidates should run on their own merit and not on their opponent's flaws. But at the same time, is something broken with the way we vote now? Is there something wrong with it?
Do you want me to respond to that?
Yes.
Given our political landscape, at the top of, I think there is. And I think this may be a way to improve that.
I still have that question then with the electoral college vote. when
Sure.
that Comes up.
Thank you for those presentations. Our next item is discussion or action to consider resolution amending Resolution 06-2018, a humanitarian policy for damage to homes caused by city water line breakups or backups in sanitary sewer or storm water lines. Our presenter is John Cole, our city administrator and attorney.
Is this in the folder? The humanitarian thing.
No, it should be. Do you not see it? No, where is it? Go back one.
Get a link for this one.
Back another one.
Sorry, council, we're just trying to make sure we get the right document. And so, council, the reason this is coming back before you, the adjuster went out to the homes that were affected by this water leak and gave us an official quote. I think Annette has the official numbers for that.
On one of them. But
So on one of the homes, it came in at $10,000. On the other one, it's expected to be similar. They both had a bunch of water damage. And so the question was brought up, is there a reason to, and let me zoom in on it, to tweak this $4,000 number to a higher amount to allow for that type of thing? What we're seeing is typically $4,000 in some instances is only going to cover the cleanup. And so that's just the question for the council to consider and why bring it back. Dave's here. He can answer questions, and Annette, I think, has more information. She's been the one that's been interacting with the adjuster on these properties.
Council, when we originally put this in the our insurance policy, and I don't know if you remember when our insurance representative came and spoke with you. It was in 2017. This was put in at up to $10,000. So at that time, in that next budget year, we put in $25,000 to start it rolling. And after this meeting you had where you had it not to exceed $4,000, our insurance agent called us and said, in our policy, it can't go lower than up to $5,000. But they had put in our policy up to $10,000. And what happens is they give us the use of their adjuster, and they go out and do all the things. And then once all the claims come in, they pay the amount that we decide up to what amount. And right now they have up to $10,000 in our policy. So they pay that and then bill us for that amount. And we did that purposely so our insurance rates wouldn't go up because we have so few of these a year. Instead of having a policy that's just written for this and we're paying a premium on it, which would be horrendous for us. And as long as I've been here, I believe we've had five water breaks that were no fault, and I don't remember any sewer that were no fault. Most of those are laterals, and never a stormwater issue. And our plan was to build that up every year, add money to it and build it up in case we did have some. And Evan actually came tonight. He sat down and talked with me today about a way we could do this because it's out of our 3 enterprise funds that this no-fault insurance would come out of. And anyway, I'll let Evan explain that to you.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. As we've talked about this issue, we felt like The water fund, the sewer fund, and the storm fund are the primary funds that could have a situation similar to this. In the past, we had budgeted for no-fault insurance payments in the general fund, which, the council is free to use that money as they see fit in the general fund. But in talking about it, we felt like it made more sense for this sort of thing to come out of the enterprise fund, in which the infrastructure failed. So we thought in the future it would be wise to budget an amount that could be paid for these sort of incidents if needed. And if that budget were exceeded, that we would be able to consider doing a budget amendment. So in this case, we're thinking that we would propose that the $20,000, if that's what you'd like to give or pay for those expenses and repairs, that it would come out of the water fund, since it was a water leak. And in the future, we felt like, we've talked about asset repair and replacement, and we've adjusted our utility rates in order to help pay for asset repair and replacement. Doing that has helped to build fund balance in the utility funds, and we felt like using fund balance for this sort of repair is appropriate, and that the rates that we discuss and approve as part of the budget process are designed to support repair and replacement of the existing infrastructure. So in the next budget process, our thought is that we would propose new budget accounts that would provide a budget in the water fund, the sewer fund, and the stormwater fund to cover these sort of incidents. And so in this case, we're thinking that we'd like to propose that it come out of the water fund, that we would do a budget amendment to be able to make that work in our budget. And then we'll try to be better prepared next fiscal year as we go through the budget process.
So is this an attempt just for future, or is that to help the individuals who currently need assistance?
So the $20,000 that we're talking about is for the two current residents.
Councilman Swanson?
Just so that I'm clear, that in this instance and in the instances that we're looking to cover, their insurance isn't covering.
That's right.
Our insurance is not covering, and so the homeowner would be stuck. They've gone to their insurance, we've gone to ours, and both have denied it for whatever reason. And okay, I just want that to be clear. Okay.
Other questions for Evan?
I have another question for Annette. Annette, if our not to exceed amount stays below the 10,000 that is written into our policy, then what you're saying is our policy rates are going to go up, or we're going to have a.
No, our policy can be amended.
Okay.
But because they don't put anything, they put it as low as not to exceed 5,000.
Okay.
But they originally, it was decided it would be 10,000 in the very beginning. And we did put $25,000 in that account in 2017. And this year we have $10,000 in there right now. But as Evan said, we discussed putting it in the enterprise funds, having a GL account for those, for no-fault insurance in the enterprise funds, and putting that in every year there. What we're asking is that on this resolution, we put it not to exceed $10,000 is what our insurance is suggesting. Some of these, we've had some breaks that were really minimum, and I think these two are probably the worst we've had in a long time.
I don't have a problem with the 10,000. I don't know what the rest of the council feels, but.
I don't have an issue.
Make a motion.
Mayor? Do we have a resolution number?
Yes, it's 07-2018.
2017?
07-2018.
Oh, 18, sorry. Okay. I'd like to make a motion that we amend the resolution from 4,000 to not to exceed 10,000, and the resolution number is 07-2018.
We have a motion to amend 07-2018 to increase the amount in our humanitarian fund to $10,000.
I'll second.
Have a second? Any other discussion?
Do we need to have any language in there that it'll come out of enterprise funds versus general fund?
We don't need that. We can just do it during the budget. We'll